The house had always been peaceful, sitting neatly on a quiet suburban street where families waved to one another and children played freely on the sidewalks. But like every suburban street, there was one source of tension: the ever-watchful eyes of Karen, the neighbor who believed she owned not just her property, but everyone else's too. For years, the narrator had enjoyed the tall oak tree that stood proudly in the front yard. It was more than just a tree. It was history, shade, and beauty all in one. Its thick branches stretched outward, offering relief from the summer sun, while its sturdy roots anchored the yard as if it had been guarding the property for generations. Birds built nests among the leaves, children loved climbing its low branches, and in autumn, the golden leaves scattered across the lawn like confetti. But Karen didn't see beauty. She saw inconvenience. She claimed the leaves blew into her yard, the roots threatened her driveway, and the shade darkened her flower beds. To her, the tree wasn't a symbol of nature. It was an enemy. And like every enemy, she believed it should be destroyed. Her complaints started small, with passive-aggressive comments. Then, they escalated into written notes taped to the mailbox. Soon, she began filing complaints with the HOA, insisting the tree was a hazard. Each time the complaints were dismissed, Karen grew more determined. She called the city inspectors, exaggerating the condition of the tree. She whispered rumors to other neighbors, warning them that the tree could topple at any moment and crush their cars. But the tree was perfectly healthy. Experts confirmed it multiple times, and the narrator kept all the reports neatly filed away as proof. Still, Karen wouldn't accept the facts. She believed her persistence could wear down anyone's patience, and if she complained enough, eventually she would get her way. The tension between homeowner and Karen simmered for months, creating an unspoken rivalry. Neighbors began to notice the stares from across the street, the muttered remarks when the narrator watered the lawn, and the disapproving huffs whenever leaves drifted Karen's way. But the narrator refused to give in. The tree wasn't going anywhere. The true boiling point came one late spring morning, after a storm rolled through the neighborhood. The ground was damp, the streets littered with broken branches, and puddles reflected the gray skies. As the narrator surveyed the yard, grateful the oak had weathered the storm, Karen stormed out of her house. She marched straight across the property line, pointing to the tree as if it were a crime scene. That day, she made her boldest demand yet. The tree had to be cut down immediately. She claimed the storm was proof of how dangerous it could be. She said it was only a matter of time before it crushed her garage, her car, or worse, herself. And she warned that if the tree wasn't removed, she would take matters into her own hands. The narrator stood silently, knowing there was no reasoning with her. The tree was healthy, the tree was legal, and the tree was staying. But Karen didn't like being told no. And from that moment on, she declared war. What followed was the beginning of a relentless campaign. Letters from the HOA, unexpected visits from inspectors, and even thinly veiled threats began piling up. Karen was determined to win this battle, no matter how many lines she had to cross. What Karen didn't realize was that nature has a way of evening the score. And as the days passed, the oak tree she hated so much was about to play the leading role in a story of revenge that no one on that street would ever forget. The storm that had shaken the neighborhood was only the first hint of what was to come. And while Karen prepared her next move, nature was quietly preparing its own. Karen's obsession with the tree grew stronger by the day, and with each passing week, she escalated her tactics. It began with constant phone calls to the HOA office, sometimes multiple times a day. Neighbors overheard her arguing loudly on the phone, her voice carrying across the street like a storm. She claimed the tree was diseased, that it was leaning dangerously toward her home, and that the falling leaves created a slip hazard on her driveway. None of it was true, but Karen repeated her lies with such conviction that some neighbors began to question whether there might be a problem after all. Soon, the letters began arriving. Official-looking envelopes with the HOA's logo, stamped in bold ink, appeared in the mailbox, each one filled with accusations and warnings. Fines were threatened, though none were legally enforceable, because the tree had already been inspected and deemed safe. The narrator, frustrated but calm, filed each letter away, creating a growing archive of Karen's crusade. But Karen wasn't satisfied with bureaucracy alone. She tried public humiliation, standing on her lawn and gossiping loudly whenever passers-by walked their dogs or pushed strollers down the sidewalk. She painted the tree as a menace, spreading rumors that its roots had already cracked her driveway. She complained that squirrels nesting in its branches invaded her yard, and she even claimed the tree blocked sunlight from reaching her vegetable garden, making her tomatoes wither. It was clear that Karen wasn't just bothered by the tree. She was consumed by it. And when obsession mixes with entitlement, things tend to spiral out of control. The breaking point came one evening as the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the neighborhood in orange and gold. The narrator returned home to find a strange truck parked near the curb, its bed stacked with chainsaws and equipment. Two men stood by the oak tree, examining its trunk. Alarm bells rang instantly. When asked what the I were doing, the men explained that a woman had hired them to cut down the tree, claiming it was dangerous. That woman, of course, was Karen. Fortunately, the narrator had paperwork ready. The men were shown the inspection reports, the property deeds, and proof of ownership. Realizing they had been misled, the workers quickly packed up and left, shaking their heads at Karen's deception. But the message was clear. Karen wasn't just going to complain anymore. She was ready to take action, even if it meant crossing legal boundaries. That night, the narrator barely slept. Every creak of a branch outside the window felt like a warning. Every gust of wind carried the thought of Karen's next move. Would she sneak onto the property in the dark? Would she hire someone else, less honest than the first crew? The sense of unease grew heavier with every hour. The neighbors began to notice, too. Some quietly sympathized, while others avoided getting involved. After all, Karen had a reputation for turning on anyone who opposed her. Still, whispers circulated about her erratic behavior, and for the first time, her iron grip on neighborhood gossip began to crack. People were starting to see her for what she truly was. Karen, however, didn't back down. She doubled down. She wrote long rants in the neighborhood newsletter, warning of imminent danger. She snapped photos of fallen leaves in her yard and sent them to the HOA as evidence. She even went so far as to mark the base of the oak tree with bright orange spray paint, as if preparing it for removal herself. It was at this point that something unexpected began to happen. Nature, in its quiet and relentless way, started to play a role in the feud. The oak tree, sturdy and proud, dropped acorns in abundance that season, scattering them across Karen's perfectly trimmed lawn. Squirrels gathered in droves, darting back and forth, eyeing their treasures in her flower beds. Birds perched high in the branches sang early in the mornings, right outside her bedroom window, breaking her precious silence. Karen saw it all as further proof of her battle. To her, the tree was not only an eyesore, it was mocking her. She began to lash out more aggressively, her anger spilling into every interaction. And as she pushed harder, her behavior grew more unpredictable. What Karen didn't realize was that her obsession was leading her closer and closer to the breaking point. The storm earlier in the season had only been a warning, and the neighborhood was about to witness nature deliver its own form of revenge in a way no one could have scripted. Summer pressed on, and with it came heat that baked the neighborhood in a relentless haze. The oak tree stood tall, offering shade and comfort to those who passed beneath it, while Karen simmered in anger across the street. She had grown obsessed with documenting every leaf, every twig, every acorn that found its way into her yard. Neighbors often spotted her crouching with her phone in hand, snapping photos of the ground as though she were investigating a crime scene. Her complaints reached a fever pitch when she claimed the tree was ruining her property value. She demanded that the HOA force immediate removal, insisting that buyers would never want to live near a tree so large. Once again, her claims were rejected, and once again, her fury boiled over. Karen began threatening legal action, speaking loudly about hiring lawyers and suing not only the homeowner, but also the HOA for negligence. The narrator, though tired of the constant harassment, refused to bend. The oak tree was not just a tree. It was a living piece of the property, a guardian that had stood through storms and seasons. And soon, the tree itself would remind Karen that nature answers to no one. One fateful night, a summer storm rolled into town. Thunder rattled the windows, and lightning split the sky in jagged streaks. The wind whipped roughed the neighborhood, bending branches and rattling fences. Rain poured in sheets, turning the streets into rivers of water that raced toward the drains. The oak tree swayed but held firm, its roots anchored deep in the earth. By morning, the storm had passed. The sun returned, casting long shadows across the damp lawns. The oak tree still stood proud, but not everything had survived unscathed. Karen's yard, once manicured with military precision, was a disaster. Branches from smaller, weaker trees on her property had snapped and scattered across her driveway. Her flower beds were flattened, her white picket fence leaned at an awkward angle, and her decorative garden lights lay shattered in the mud. And then there was the oak's contribution. A massive branch, thick as a man's waist, had fallen, but not onto the narrator's property. Instead, it had landed squarely in Karen's front yard. It crushed her prized rose bushes, tore up her carefully trimmed grass, and left a deep groove in her driveway where it struck the concrete. Karen's screams could be heard up and down the street that morning. She stood in her yard, hands on her head, shouting about destruction and negligence. She claimed the branch had nearly killed her, though no one had actually seen her outside during the storm. She dialed the HOA, the city, and even the police, demanding someone be held accountable. But the truth was clear. It was an act of nature, and no one could be blamed. Neighbors peeked out from their windows, some shaking their heads, others quietly laughing. They had all watched Karen wage war against the tree, and now the tree had struck back in its own way. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The oak had survived untouched on the homeowner's side, yet Karen's yard bore the scars of its power. The narrator, though sympathetic to the destruction, couldn't help but feel the weight of justice in the moment. For months, Karen had demanded the tree be cut down. For months, she had claimed it was dangerous. And yet, when danger arrived, it wasn't in the way she had predicted. The tree hadn't toppled onto her roof, nor had it destroyed her garage. Instead, it had chosen the perfect target. Her precious yard, the one she guarded with such obsessive pride. Karen's rage only grew from there. She insisted that the branch proved her right all along, that the entire tree was a ticking time bomb. But the city inspector, called out once again, confirmed what had been said all along. The tree was healthy, strong, and in no danger of falling. The branch that fell had been weakened by the storm, nothing more. To Karen, this explanation wasn't enough. She vowed revenge, louder than ever before, shouting at the homeowner from across the street and muttering curses under her breath whenever she walked by. But to everyone else, the storm had been a turning point. It was the moment nature itself seemed to weigh in on the dispute, leaving Karen humiliated and furious. Little did she know, this was only the beginning. The oak tree wasn't finished yet, and the next strike would be even more devastating. The storm had left its mark not only on Karen's property, but also on her pride. For years, she had carefully cultivated the image of being the neighborhood's self-appointed guardian, the one who demanded perfection from everyone else. But now, her own yard looked like a battlefield, and the very tree she despised had been the cause. For most people, such an event might have been humbling. It might have been an opportunity to step back, acknowledge defeat, and move on. But Karen was not most people. To her, the storm was not nature's doing. It was a declaration of war. She convinced herself that the tree had targeted her specifically, that fate had chosen to humiliate her. And with that twisted reasoning, she decided she would not rest until the oak was gone forever. Her tactics became more direct. At first, she plastered signs around the neighborhood, warning others about the dangerous tree. The signs claimed the oak had nearly killed her, that its branches were unstable, and that it threatened the safety of children walking nearby. Neighbors shook their heads and tore the signs down, but Karen simply replaced them with more. When that failed, she took her campaign online. Social media posts began circulating within local community groups, filled with dramatic pictures of the fallen branch in her yard, and captions painting the homeowner as reckless and irresponsible. She demanded that people boycott the family until the tree was removed. But instead of rallying support, her posts only attracted ridicule. Residents who had dealt with Karen before shared their own stories, and soon the narrative shifted. The once feared neighbor was becoming a laughingstock. The ridicule fueled her anger. She started watching the oak tree with the intensity of a predator, standing at her window with binoculars or pacing her lawn as though waiting for the next branch to fall. She documented every leaf that blew across the property line, every bird that nested in the branches, and every squirrel that dared to dig in her flower beds. It was as if the tree had become her sworn enemy, and she treated its very existence as a personal attack. But Karen wasn't content with simply complaining anymore. She began plotting her own form of revenge. Late at night, lights flickered in her garage as she worked on projects no one could see. Strange tools were heard clattering, and more than once, neighbors spotted her sneaking into her yard under the cover of darkness with flashlights. One evening, the homeowner noticed something alarming. Bright orange paint marks appeared again at the base of the oak. This time, they weren't Karen's idle threats. They were symbols sprayed hastily like someone had been measuring for a cut. The paint stains bled into the bark, stark reminders of how far Karen was willing to go. Concerned, the narrator invested in security cameras, installing them discreetly around the property. If Karen tried anything, there would be proof. The cameras captured plenty of strange footage in the nights that followed. Karen pacing near the tree, circling like a restless animal, sometimes even muttering to herself. She seemed to be working up the courage to act. But just as Karen was plotting her revenge, nature had plans of its own. That summer brought an unusually heavy rainfall season, and with it came something Karen had not anticipated. The oak tree's roots, strengthened by the water, began to stretch even further underground. They didn't threaten the narrator's property, but they found their way beneath Karen's driveway. Cracks began to appear in the concrete, small at first, then larger as the weeks went by. Karen noticed immediately, of course, and blamed the tree. She screamed that it was attacking her home, that it was out to destroy her property. She stomped across the street, demanding immediate removal, only to be met with calm reminders that the tree was on private property and that it had been deemed safe time and again. The cracks grew worse, spreading like veins across her driveway until pieces of concrete began to lift. Her once pristine entrance, which she had boasted about for years, now looked like it was buckling under invisible pressure. To Karen, this was confirmation of her fears. The tree wasn't just an enemy, it was waging war against her. The irony, of course, was clear to everyone else. The oak tree had stood in the same place for decades, long before Karen moved into the neighborhood. The roots had grown slowly, silently, as trees do. But the timing of their spread, coming right after her campaign of harassment, made it seem as though the tree itself had chosen its moment of retaliation. Neighbors whispered about karma, about nature Javi, and a sense of humor. Karen, however, only grew more determined. She vowed that if no one else would take the tree down, she would. Karen's threats were no longer idle words whispered in frustration. They had become promises. By now, everyone in the neighborhood had heard her declaration. If no one else removed the oak, she would. And while many dismissed it as bluster, The homeowner knew better. Karen's obsession had grown beyond reason, and people consumed by obsession rarely stopped before causing real damage. The first sign came one quiet evening. Security cameras captured her creeping across the property line, carrying a small hacksaw. She knelt at the base of the oak, her movements frantic, sawing at the bark as though she could topple the massive tree with nothing but determination. After only minutes, she gave up, leaving shallow scars across the trunk before darting back into the darkness. The marks were minor, but they were proof. Karen had crossed the line from harassment into destruction. The footage was shared with the HOA and the local authorities. Warnings were issued, and Karen was ordered to stay off the property. But she laughed off the consequences, claiming she was protecting the neighborhood. Even when confronted with evidence, she insisted she was in the right, her voice shrill and unrelenting. The law might have stopped others, but Karen saw herself above it. Her next attempt was bolder. A few nights later, the sound of engines echoed down the street. Another truck had pulled up, this time under cover of darkness, its headlights off. Two men stepped out with tools in hand, but as they approached the tree, motion lights burst to life, flooding the yard with brightness. Caught off guard, the men hesitated before fleeing into the night, leaving behind ropes and half-unpacked equipment. Whether they were hired or simply manipulated by Karen's claims, and it was clear she had once again tried to orchestrate the tree's removal. By now, the neighborhood had turned against he. Completely. Neighbors who once tolerated her antics began siding openly with the homeowner, disgusted by her recklessness. Some even offered to help repair the damage to the tree, wrapping the scarred bark with protective sealant and ensuring its roots remained healthy. Karen, isolated and furious, shouted accusations across the street, insisting everyone had betrayed her. But while her campaign of destruction faltered, nature prepared a more decisive response. The heavy rains that had cracked her driveway earlier now gave way to late summer storms, the kind that rolled in without warning. One evening, as the skies turned black and thunder roared overhead, a gust of wind tore through the neighborhood with violent force. The oak tree swayed, but it held firm. Yet on Karen's property, things were less stable. A massive limb from one of her own smaller trees snapped under the strain, crashing down onto her freshly repaired fence. The wood splintered, collapsing in a heap, while the fallen branch blocked her driveway entirely. She wailed into the storm, blaming the oak once again, screaming into the rain that her enemy had cursed her. For everyone else, the irony was undeniable. Karen's own trees, weakened by neglect, were the ones falling apart. The oak, sturdy and strong, stood untouched. Neighbors whispered that it was poetic justice, that nature was punishing her directly. And as the storm raged on, the cracks in Karen's perfect world spread wider than the fractures in her driveway. By now, the battle lines were drawn. Karen wasn't just fighting a tree, she was fighting nature itself. And nature, patient and powerful, was far from finished. The storm that had ripped through the neighborhood marked the breaking point in the long battle. Karen's yard was now scarred by fallen branches, her driveway fractured by spreading roots, and her reputation shattered beyond repair. Where once she strutted across her lawn with authority, she now paced with the desperation of someone who had lost control of everything she tried to dominate. But nature wasn't done. The final act came not with thunder and lightning, but with something far more subtle, far more humiliating. As the summer faded into autumn, the oak tree prepared for the season in its quiet, powerful way. Leaves turned golden, fluttering down in waves that blanketed the ground in rich colors. On the narrator's side, it was beautiful. Children came by to play in the piles, neighbors admired the view, and even strangers slowed to take pictures of the towering tree glowing in the afternoon sun. On Karen's side, it was a nightmare. The wind carried the leaves into her yard in droves, covering her cracked driveway and filling her gutters. Every morning she could be seen out there, broom in hand, frantically sweeping, only to have more leaves fall by evening. She muttered to herself as she worked, each new pile of leaves fueling her rage. What she saw as torment, others saw as the tree's final victory, a reminder that nature would always move at its own pace, no matter how much Karen fought it. Her breaking point came one Saturday afternoon. Determined to prove she could win, she brought out a leaf blower and blasted the leaves back across the property line. But the gusts of wind turned against her, carrying the leaves in circles until her yard was more buried than before. Neighbors watched from porches and windows as Karen screamed in frustration, her efforts undone by nothing more than the breeze. It was poetic justice, nature's way of showing that her war had never truly been against a tree. It had been against the inevitable. The oak stood firm, unmoved, timeless, while Karen, frantic and bitter, flailed against forces she could never control. By winter, Karen had grown quiet. The HOA no longer entertained her complaints, the neighbors no longer listened to her rants, and the homeowner no longer worried about her late-night threats. The oak tree, scarred but unbroken, stood tall as a living monument to resilience. And Karen, once the loudest voice on the street, had become little more than a cautionary tale whispered about in hushed laughter. In the end, it wasn't lawyers, inspectors, or arguments that decided the feud. It was nature itself, patient, relentless, and ultimately victorious. The oak tree remained, stronger than ever, while Karen's legacy crumbled alongside her cracked driveway and shattered pride. The neighborhood moved on, but the story lived on, too, told as a reminder that some battles can never be won, not against neighbors, not against time, and certainly not against nature.